Hey scholars, it's Miss Davidson. I'm recording this on Friday, April 3rd, so happy Friday. Today we'll be going over chapter 3, Gloomy Castles and Jousting Knights. So this is the third chapter in our text, The Middle Ages, Knights, Castles, and Chivalry, which is giving us information all about medieval times. If you haven't read chapter 1 and chapter 2 with us, go back and do that. Find those videos so that you can catch up and have some of the notes you'll need today. You have this already in your notes. So talking about nouns and adjectives again today. Nouns are words that name people, places, and things. We've had some practice with this and we're going to do some more today. Common nouns are general and are not capitalized. Proper nouns are specific and these are capitalized. We need to make sure we follow those rules in our writing, that we are not capitalizing things that shouldn't be, and we are capitalizing those proper nouns. And then adjectives, of course, are words that describe the nouns. So as we do practice today, this will be in the Google Classroom. The directions say write in period above the nouns and ADJ period above the adjectives. Draw an arrow from the adjective to the noun it describes. So this is giving us a little bit more thinking to do on our own this time. I remember in our last practice, each numbered sentence had a clue to tell us how many nouns and adjectives were in each one. This time it's up to you to find those on your own. So here in the example, soldiers, they've labeled a noun because those are people. Wore padded coats. The coats are the things and they're described as padded. So that's the adjective. And then you can see that they've drawn an arrow from their adjective to show which noun it's describing. So they're not padded soldiers, they're padded coats. That's the adjective describing the noun coats. And carried sharp daggers. What kind of daggers or things are they? The daggers are the noun, so they are sharp. That's the describing word. They're sharp daggers. So let's do number 1 together. You can add this below your other work if you need to look at your anchor chart while you go. Number 1, I'm going to write the whole sentence. A lance is a long wooden pole with a metal tip. All right, so there are a lot of words to think about in this sentence. A lance is a long wooden pole. So that tells me lance is a thing, and I label it with an N on top, just like this. A lance is a long wooden pole. So the pole is the thing, the noun, and then they're describing that pole as long. Long is an adjective, and also as wooden. So that is another adjective. So we actually have 2 adjectives describing the noun pole. I'm going to draw an arrow from wooden to pole, and I'm also going to draw an arrow from long to pole. So we can have many adjectives describing one noun in a sentence. In this case, there's only 2, but there could be more. And then as we continue to finish our sentence, it's given us a little bit more information with a metal tip. So the tip is the thing that we're describing, that's the noun. And metal could be a noun. In this case, they're using it as an adjective. So what kind of tip is it? It's metal. So we're going to write A-D-J and an arrow. It's a metal tip. So a lance is a long wooden pole with a metal tip. That might be something that we learn more about in this chapter if you've never heard of that tool before. So as you're finishing this, you'll just write sentences 2 through 5 and do the same thing. You can take a picture of that with a camera, or if you have a way to do it on the computer, you can do that as well to turn into me, and I'll make sure that your teachers know that you're working hard on this. All right, and last time we also talked about prefixes and had some practice with that. Prefix is a syllable or syllables, placed at the beginning of a root word to change the word's meaning. So some examples we talked about last time were un and non. Both of those prefixes mean not. There are also other prefixes that mean not, but these are the examples we're using right now to talk about. Some of the words we saw last time were unexpected and expected. So something that is expected, we think will happen, we can predict. If it's unexpected, it's not expected and we couldn't predict it. Something that is threatening makes us feel afraid. Something that is non-threatening is not threatening, and it does not make us feel afraid. It's not a threat. So today we're going to use some more practice with the prefixes un and non. In this practice, we're going to write the best word to complete each sentence. So you'll see here on each number, there's a line. That's the blank that you're filling in. It gives us 4 choices underneath: unfamiliar, familiar, necessary, unnecessary, and necessary. So I know that unfamiliar just means not familiar. It's the opposite of the word without that prefix. And the same with unnecessary is the opposite of necessary. It means it's not necessary. So let's see which one will make sense with number 1. For this, I can just write the number and the word. I don't need to write the whole sentence. If you want to help you practice that spelling, that's great too. So it says, please only take 1 piece of candy. Any more than that is blank. So what would that be? Is unfamiliar or familiar? Familiar means something that we already have knowledge about. Is taking 1 piece of candy familiar? I'm not sure. Or unfamiliar, not familiar, something we don't know about? I'm not sure that makes sense. Let's look at unnecessary and necessary. Necessary means it's something that you need. Is taking more than, please take only 1 piece of candy. Any more than that is unnecessary, not needed, or necessary, needed. Any more than that is not needed. That seems right. Any more than that is needed. No, we don't need more than 1 piece of candy. So our best choice to fill in that sentence, the last word will be unnecessary. So same thing for the next 5, 2 through 6. You'll read the sentence, go through the 4 choices and think which one makes the most sense and fill those in. I'll be sure to give you feedback if you turn it in to let you know if you chose the best word. All right, our purpose for reading chapter 3 today will be to read carefully to find out the role of knights and castles in the Middle Ages. So you may have a little bit of background knowledge about knights and castles and what they are, but today we're thinking about their role in the society. So what their purpose was, what their function was for the society in the medieval times, in the Middle Ages. And then our big question we're thinking about is, why was there a need for knights and castles during the Middle Ages? We don't have knights and castles in Texas or in Dallas right now. So why did they need those in Europe during the Middle Ages? That's what we're thinking about today. All right, before we get started on our reading, I want to write these new vocabulary words in my glossary. If you want to continue where we left off in chapter 2, that's fine, or if you're starting a new page, that's okay as well. The first word that we will be adding to our list today is armor. A-R-M-O-R. There's 2 R-controlled vowels in that word. Both syllables have an R-controlled vowel. R, A-R, and more, O-R, armor. And that we see the part of speech is a noun. Armor is a thing. And armor is protective metal covering used to keep a person safe from injury during battle. And if you're using it as an adjective, it would be armored. If the knight is if there's an armored knight, he is wearing that armor. All right. The number 2 says esteemed. E-S-T-E-E-M-E-D. ed. So we know that sometimes the suffix ed can mean during the past. In this case, we're turning this into an adjective. We're saying that it's a describing word. So something that is esteemed is highly regarded or admired. If you admire someone, you look up to them. You think that they have a high status and they're doing things well, and you respect them. They're esteemed. Number 3, the word we're adding is influential. I-N-F-L-U, influential. I've heard the word influence before. An influence is a noun, it's a thing, but influential is an adjective. It's describing something that's having power to change or affect important things or people. So if your parents say, you know, I think your friend is a good influence on you, that means that they are influential and they're helping you to make good choices. Influential. The next word is title, which we hear that word a lot, but this is a multiple meaning word. A title in a text is obviously the first part that we read to let us know what it's all about. This title is also a thing, it's a noun, but this refers to a name that describes a person's job or status. So in English, when we're talking about our teacher's status, we just say Mr. or Mrs. or Miss. That's the title. In other languages, we might say profesora or profesoro is their title. They're the teacher of the class. So another title that we could see in our society still is doctor, D-R period, or we might could say professor if it's someone from a college that's teaching that class. That's their title. All right. So number 5 is ransom. R-A-N-S-O-M. Ransom is a noun. It's a thing. And ransom is money that is paid to free someone who is captured. So in a war, your rivals, the people who you're fighting against, might capture one of your soldiers, and they would ask for ransom to get you back to your people. So it's money that they would have to pay in order to get that person back from their opponents. Is ransom. The next word is aspiring. A-S-P-I-R-I-N-G. Aspiring is an adjective describing hoping to be or become something. So if you, when you grow up, would like to be an athlete, you could say that you're an aspiring athlete. You're hoping to be an athlete someday. If you're an aspiring doctor or an aspiring lawyer or any other job like that, you're hoping to become one someday. There's 2 more words for this chapter. 7 is enclose, E-N-C-L-O-S-E. It has that prefix E-N. Enclose is a verb. So to enclose is to surround, close in. So if you're enclosing something, you're coming all the way around it on each side and surrounding it. The last word is siege. S-E-I-G-E. Siege. The G is followed by an E, so it's making it a soft sound that sounds like a J. Siege is a thing, it's a noun. That means a situation in which soldiers or police officers surround a city or building to try to take control of it. So you may have noticed there's quite a few of our vocabulary words today, which have to do with battle or war. Siege is one of those, where the group of soldiers or police officers has to surround something in order to take control of it. The people inside are not doing what they want, and they need to take control. So I'm going to pause for just a second. If you need to pause the video to catch up on any of these definitions, do that now, and we'll be ready to start reading. All right, here we are at chapter 3. Remember, as we're reading, the big question we're asking ourselves and trying to think about is, why was there a need for knights and castles during the Middle Ages? Why did they need to be there? What was their purpose? Gloomy castles and jousting knights. Whether rich or poor, young men in the Middle Ages learned how to use a weapon of some kind. Rivalries between nobles, wars with other nations, even violence between neighbors required that they be able to fight. When a lord needed to raise an army, he turned to those he governed. In the Middle Ages, ordinary foot soldiers were trained to fight with an axe and a long spear called a pike. Others were trained to be skillful archers and crossbowmen. Some foot soldiers might have worn chainmail, an early form of metal armor, but most had padded coats and carried daggers. However, the most esteemed soldiers were knights. So down here we can see the crossbowmen, the person using the archers, they're using a bow and arrow to shoot. And then this is a pikeman. He's using that long spear and axe to fight. The crossbowman and the pikeman. Knights were soldiers who fought on horseback and sometimes on foot for their lord. If you wanted to be a knight, you had to be able to afford horses and armor. You also had to find someone willing to train you. Because it was very expensive to become a knight, these mounted warriors were usually sons of wealthy, influential members of society. Here there's an illustration of a knight on their horse, and this says knight in suit of armor, riding armed horse. So not only did the knight have armor, the horse did as well. Being a knight was one way of making fortune. If you were involved in successful battles and wars, you might receive money or land as payment for your services. Sometimes a king might also reward you with a title. Having a title usually meant that you were an influential member of society. Knights also made money by looting and by holding certain people for ransom. So I'm hearing that some of the reasons that we needed knights during the Middle Ages was to protect the lords and to protect their land. Their motivation was maybe just to make money as well and to make a name for themselves, to get a title. And this subheading says, if you were a knight, we're putting ourselves in that position if we were knights. Your training to become a knight begins at a young age. You leave home to live with a family, friend, or relative who has agreed to train you. In the first several years of your training, you help to dress and serve the Lord. You are known as a page. During these early years as an aspiring knight, you probably learn to use a sword, to ride a horse, and to wield a lance, or long wooden pole with a metal tip. Later, when you are ready to learn more challenging skills, you become a squire. So here in this illustration, a young boy is training to be a knight. Although you are still a servant, as a squire, you are now responsible for grooming and saddling the Lord's horses. You are also responsible for cleaning and polishing his armor. You learn how to fight while riding a horse. You learn to use other weapons, including a heavier lance. This part of your training lasts for several years. And here this illustration shows squires learned to fight with swords. So if you are a squire or a page, it's kind of like being an intern. You're not being paid for your work, and you still don't have very much power, but you're working to learn those skills so that later you can. I'm kind of thinking this reminds me of the Disney movie The Sword and the Stone. The main character is training to be a knight, and they call him a squire. If you are a successful squire, you might be knighted by the Lord. In what is called the dubbing ceremony, the Lord taps you on the shoulder with a flat part of his sword. Then a priest might bless you with a prayer. Here we see he's holding up his sword, and he's going to make that flat part touch on each side of his shoulders when the king is knighting a squire. This is the ceremony where he's kind of graduating into his new role. This section says the way of the knight. In France in the 1100s and 1200s, certain expectations about how knights should behave in society were developed. The term chivalry, which refers to a warrior, horseman, or knight, became the term used to describe these expectations. These ideas of chivalry spread to other European countries. Knights were expected to serve their lord. They were required to honor and protect the church and weaker members of society. They were also expected to treat other knights captured in battle as honored guests until a ransom was received. Sometimes it took months before a captured knight's family paid up. Once payment was received, the captured knight was free to go home. And here we see some more illustrations. Knights were supposed to be brave in battle, and also a knight was expected to guard and protect weaker members of society. So a part of chivalry was the idea that if you had this power as a knight, you had a duty or responsibility to help people who did not have that same amount of power. And here this section is called Charge. Knights could prove their strengths and abilities by taking part in jousting matches. Jousting matches were mock or pretend battles between two or more knights. Knights rode horses, wore full armor, and carried lances. Those who took part in jousts did so to gain respect and possibly a generous prize. For the privileged, attending the jousting matches was considered to be a day of excitement and entertainment. It was very much like watching a football or baseball game today. When the joust began, the knights charged at each other. With the aid of a lance, each knight attempted to knock his opponent off his horse. And here we see an illustration of that, knights competing in a joust. And here it shows us jousting was a popular sport. So if you were a knight, you could enter a competition for a jousting match to try to win a prize. And then people would come to watch you, like at a sporting game, like a soccer game. Cold, dark, and gloomy. Many kings and nobles lived in castles. Castles provided the inhabitants, or people who lived there, with a certain amount of protection from the enemy. So thinking back to our big question, part of the purpose of a castle is to provide the inhabitants, or people who lived there, with a certain amount of protection from the enemy. They were also fairly safe places to store weapons and food supplies. The first castles were wooden forts. Later, people built stronger castles made of stone. And here we see a modern reconstruction of wooden castle. So this is a photograph of one that people have recreated to see what that would look like. Castle walls sometimes enclosed a series of small buildings like a little town. The castle had a water supply within the walls. Residents also needed a good supply of food inside so that they could withstand a siege. For added protection, some castles were surrounded by moats. The moat was a deep trench, often filled with water. Sometimes there was a drawbridge that could be raised or lowered. Over time, castles became more elaborate with interior courtyards, living quarters for soldiers, and stables. Stables are where you keep the horses. By today's standards, life in the castle was not very pleasant. Castles were cold and gloomy. They were designed for protection, not comfort. Most castles had only a few rooms. There was typically a great hall, a kitchen, and 2 or 3 private chambers or rooms for the lord and his family. There was no bathroom, just a tiny alcove that jutted out of the castle wall. The contents of the toilet emptied into the moat or a pit directly below. Can you imagine the smell? So here we're seeing a picture of a castle in England with a moat. It's kind of like a small river that just goes in a circle so that nobody can walk straight up to the castle. They would have to swim or find another way. And then here we can see a stone castle in France. This was built in the past, but these are still there today. So if you visit some of these places in Europe, there are buildings that are over 1,000 years old that were built in the past that you can still see today. This is an example of one that people built just so that they could see what it would look like in the present. And here we have this illustration, and it's kind of like a diagram showing us the different parts of a medieval castle. So here we're zoomed in to down here where soldiers guarded the walls. They stood along these platforms so that they could see over the walls to find enemies who were coming. Here's a tower, a gatehouse, so they could lower this drawbridge and pull it back up so that no one could get across the moat. They could lower it down if people were needing to get inside. There's the outer wall. And then here we can see more of the inside. This zooms into the kitchen, would be inside here. The keep, the Lord's chamber, the place where the Lord lived. The great hall, where they might eat their meals. And then here is the moat. Again, it's just that water going around to give them extra protection from enemies. A castle's great hall, here is an illustration, had many uses. The great hall was where family members and their guests gathered. Meals were served in the great hall. Entertainers performed there, and and even servants slept there. Buckets of hot coals or fireplaces provided the fire needed for heat and cooking. Small windows and candles offered little light. Traveling storytellers, minstrels, and troops of actors often visited the castle. Quite often, jesters lived in the castle, ready to perform whenever requested. Noble children and adults in the Middle Ages enjoyed music and dancing. They played outdoor sports as well. Tennis, croquet, and bowling all began as lawn games during this period in history. And here's an illustration of some medieval musicians that might travel from castle to castle to get paid to entertain the noblemen. All right, and we have some more medieval musings and another letter request for this chapter. If you wrote these down for the last chapter, you'll want to add to them today. So some of our medieval musings, topics that you could research more on your own. Number 1 says the invention of new weapons brought an end to the era of knights and jousting. What were these noisy weapons called? Number 2 asks if a knight dishonored himself in some way by being disloyal or dishonest. He stood trial before a very important member of society. Who would have been his judge? Who was deciding what to do with him if he dishonored himself? And then here we have another letter quest. So within this illustration, you're going to find the letter and record it with your other letter from chapter 2. Okay, and this image will be posted in Google Classroom if you need to go back to it. All right, that's all for chapter 3. In chapter 4, we'll learn more about merchants, markets, and mud, the towns in the Middle Ages. If you have any questions about any of the things that you're needing to turn in for this chapter, please just let me know. You can comment or send me an email. I'll see you guys next week.